In 1965, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania made a discovery he didn't expect. He was studying fear in dogs, standard conditioning research. Nothing that should have produced anything unusual. But one group of dogs did something that stopped him completely. They had a way out. The barrier was low. They could see the other side. They had jumped barriers before. The exit was right there, and they lay down. They didn't try. They didn't struggle. They didn't explore. They didn't look for the way out. They just lay down and accepted what was happening to them. The psychologist's name was Martin Seligman. The thing he discovered that day has since been documented in hundreds of studies across every species that has been tested, including ours. And the name he gave it is the most quietly devastating phrase in the history of psychology. He called it learned helplessness. And by the end of this video, you will understand not just what it is, but where it lives in you, and whether you have already learned it without knowing. The experiment was not designed to discover learned helplessness. Seligman was running a study on classical conditioning, the relationship between fear and learned associations. He needed dogs that had been conditioned to fear a particular tone, standard procedure for the time. In the first phase, dogs were placed in a harness. They heard a tone, then they received a mild electric shock. This was repeated until the dogs associated the tone with the shock. They would flinch at the sound before anything happened. Standard, expected. The experiment was going as designed. But there was a specific group of dogs in that first phase whose shocks could not be stopped. No lever to press, no action that would terminate the discomfort. Whatever they did, the shock continued until the experimenter chose to end it. I want you to hold that detail. It becomes the answer to the mystery. In the second phase, all the dogs were placed in a different apparatus, a shuttle box. A simple two-chambered box with a low barrier between the two sides. One side of the box had an electrified floor. The other side did not. The barrier between them was low enough to step over. Low enough that a dog could see the other side clearly. The experiment was simple. When the shock begins, jump the barrier and escape. The dogs who had experienced controllable shocks in the first phase, the ones who had learned that their actions could stop the discomfort, learned to jump immediately. Within a few trials, they were escaping easily. The exit was there. They used it. The dogs who had experienced uncontrollable shocks did something different. They didn't jump. At first, when the shock began, they moved around. They showed distress. They looked like dogs that were trying to find a solution. And then, after a short time, something changed. They stopped moving. They lay down. They accepted the shock. The exit was 18 inches away. They could see it. They could have reached it in one movement. But they lay down and endured because their nervous systems had already concluded, from the first phase of the experiment, where no action had ever worked, that action was futile. Seligman tried everything to help them. He called to them. He showed them the other side. He removed the barrier entirely and opened the box into a completely accessible space. The dogs lay there. The only thing that worked, the only intervention that eventually restored their ability to escape, was physically picking them up and moving their legs in the pattern of jumping, over and over, until their bodies remembered that movement was possible. That action produced outcomes. The mechanism that Seligman identified is this. When a living creature, any living creature, experiences repeated situations where its actions have no effect on the outcome, it learns something, not a fact, not a belief, something more fundamental than either. It learns at the level of neural wiring that response and outcome are not connected, that what it does doesn't matter, that trying is pointless. And once that learning is established, once the nervous system has genuinely concluded that action is futile, it does not simply apply to the situation where the learning occurred. It generalizes. The brain doesn't say, action is futile in harnesses in laboratories. It says, action is futile, full stop. And the next time an escape route appears, The brain doesn't register it as an escape route. It registers it as irrelevant. I want to tell you about what Seligman found when he tested this in humans, because the animal results alone are disturbing enough. But the human results contain something specific that changes the meaning of everything that came before. Donald Hiroto, a colleague of Seligman, ran the human version of the experiment in 1974. Participants were exposed to an unpleasant loud noise. One group could stop the noise by pressing a button. Another group could not. The noise ran until Hiroto chose to stop it. Then both groups were placed in a new situation where the noise could be stopped by simply moving their hand to a different position. A trivial action. Obvious. Available. The group that had experienced controllable noise learned immediately. The group that had experienced uncontrollable noise largely did nothing. They sat in the discomfort. They didn't move their hand. Some of them didn't even try. When asked afterward why they hadn't moved their hand, many of them said, "It wouldn't have mattered anyway. It wouldn't have mattered anyway." The exit was a hand movement away. They had concluded from a previous experience in a different situation with a completely different mechanism. That action would not produce relief, and so they didn't act. Seligman spent the next decade studying the human implications. He found learned helplessness in people experiencing depression, the specific pattern of believing that nothing they do will change their situation, regardless of evidence. He found it in students who had repeated academic failures, who stopped engaging with new material not because they lacked ability, but because they had concluded that their effort would not produce results. He found it in workers in environments where their input had repeatedly been ignored, who stopped making suggestions not because they had no ideas, but because the ideas had never mattered. Learned helplessness is not pessimism. It is not laziness. It is not weakness of character. It is the accurate recording of a pattern, the brain doing exactly what it is designed to do, which is learn from experience. Applied to a situation where the experience being recorded was one of genuine powerlessness. The problem is not the learning. The problem is when the situation changes and the learning doesn't. And there is one more detail from Seligman's research that I have not told you yet. One more finding that changes the shape of the entire story. About 1/3 of the subjects, human and animal, did not develop learned helplessness, no matter how many uncontrollable experiences they were exposed to, no matter how thoroughly the first experiment had established that action was futile. They kept trying. They found the exit. They moved their hand. They jumped the barrier. I want to bring you out of the laboratory, out of the shuttle box and the harnesses and the recorded data, into something smaller and more personal. There is something in your life that you have stopped trying to change. Not because you've thought it through and decided it's unchangeable. Not because you've gathered evidence and concluded that effort is futile. But because you have tried, repeatedly in the past, and the effort didn't produce the result. And at some point your brain recorded that pattern and quietly, without announcement, stopped registering that thing as something worth trying to change. You no longer see the barrier as something to jump. You see the room you're in as the room there is. The other side isn't visible as an option, because your nervous system has already processed it as irrelevant, not painful, not consciously rejected, just not present as a possibility. The door is open. You're not trying to open it because you stopped noticing it was a door. This is not always a relationship, not always a job, not always a circumstance. Sometimes it is a version of yourself, a capacity you had and stopped exercising because the times you exercised it didn't produce what you needed. A belief about what you're capable of that was formed during a period when the conditions were stacked against you, and that has continued to operate even after the conditions changed. The most accurate description of learned helplessness is not, "I can't." It is, "I don't try." And the difference between those two sentences is the entire distance between a cage with locked doors and a cage with open ones that you've stopped checking. Earlier, I asked you to hold a detail, the dogs that had experienced uncontrollable shocks, the ones where no action ever worked. That is the origin of learned helplessness. Not repeated failure, not absence of ability. The specific experience of repeated situations where effort had no relationship to outcome, where the connection between action and result was severed. Think about the environments you have lived in, the relationships, the workplaces, the families. The periods where, no matter what you did, the result was the same, not because you were wrong or weak, but because the system around you was not one where individual action reliably produced individual results. The question is not whether you experienced those conditions. Most people have. The question is what your nervous system learned from them, and whether that learning is still operating in rooms where the conditions have already changed. The 1/3. Seligman spent years trying to understand why 1/3 of subjects never developed learned helplessness. What protected them? What made their nervous systems respond differently to the same experiences? He found it in what he called explanatory style, the specific way a person explains negative events to themselves. The people who did not develop helplessness tended to explain negative events as temporary rather than permanent, specific rather than pervasive, external rather than entirely internal, not, "This is how things are," but, "This is how things are right now, in this specific situation, for these particular reasons." That distinction, between permanent and temporary, between pervasive and specific, is the entire psychological distance between lying down in the shuttle box and jumping the barrier. It is a cognitive habit. And cognitive habits, unlike neural wiring that occurs under genuine helplessness, can be changed. Seligman eventually figured out how to help the dogs. Not by showing them the exit, not by removing the barrier, not by making the other side more appealing, by physically moving their legs, by making their bodies experience, against their own resistance, the pattern of action that produced escape, over and over, until the body remembered that movement was connected to outcome, until the nervous system updated its record. The human equivalent is not comfortable. It requires taking an action in a domain where you have learned that action is futile and experiencing the outcome. Not being told the outcome will be different, not reasoning your way to the conclusion that it might be. Actually doing the thing and letting the result update the record. This is why insight alone doesn't cure learned helplessness. You can understand the mechanism completely. You can watch this video, recognize yourself, understand exactly where the learning came from, and the pattern will persist until you act. The cage door is not opened by understanding that it's open. It's opened by walking through it. Think about the thing you stopped trying to change. Not the relationship, the job, the circumstance that genuinely cannot change. The other one, the one that might have changed since you last tried. The one where the conditions may no longer be what they were when you learned that effort was futile. The only way to know if the door is still locked is to try it. That is the entire intervention. Not optimism, not affirmations, not a restructured belief system. The action that you have stopped taken once more. The leg movement that your body has forgotten. The hand moved to the new position, one time, to find out if the outcome has changed. Seligman's most important finding was not learned helplessness. It was learned optimism. The discovery that the same mechanism that teaches a nervous system futility can teach it agency. That the brain which learned one pattern from experience can learn a different pattern from different experience. You are not the first experiment. You are not the harness. You are not even the shuttle box. You are whatever happens after someone picks you up and moves your legs until you remember that jumping is something you know how to do. My name doesn't matter, but now you know which room you're in, and you know how to check if the door is open.